Hello and welcome to the 15th chapter of the course. In this chapter, we will be looking at how we adjust our preflop strategies when there is a super sort or an auto-lean stack. What I mean by auto-lean stack is someone who has lost almost his entire stack to the previous hand, so now he's left with basically no chips. We saw at some responses against super sort stacks with relevant bounties in the limping chapter, but I will refresh your memories. And basically what we had there was that whenever there was a very short stack with a relevant bounty, then we would pretty much play range limps. So limping with our entire range. For example, we had this scenario where the hijack had 60 big blinds, cutoff 40, small blind 50, big blind 47, and the battle was with 6 big blinds. So basically the main change here would be that the battle was very short, and then the hijack was covering everyone with 60 big blinds. And what we had here was that the hijack was limping his entire range. And the idea is that we want to maximize the range we can get it in with against a very short stack with the big bounty in relation to the stack. The same was true for all the other positions, that in this spot, the 5 big blind stack size or 6 big blind stack size in the battle was influencing everyone and putting them into a range limping strategy. And the same thing is true whenever we have any of those short stack size, like super short, where the bounty is worth multiple times their stack. Whether we are from early position or later positions, when there is a stack that is super short with a big bounty, by super short, I mean below like 7, 8 big blinds, then we simply want to be limping everything so that we can get it in against said short stack with our entire range. We don't care so much about folding other players out of the pot. We instead care about getting it in against the short stack with a big bounty. As a reminder, back to the limping chapter, after the hijack limped, then the players behind were also very incentivized to overlimp for the same reason, to maximize the range they can get it with against the bottom with a very short stack. So what about if there is an auto all-in stack, so that doesn't have the chance to fold? What happens then? Do we have raises, jumps? Do we limp? How does it work? And the answer is it depends on how big the bounty actually is. However, we pretty much want to be limping only. Now, if the bounty is very large, then we get to have some jumps as well. Like, for example, if the auto-link stack has, let's say, a 20 big blind bounty worth, then we would be jamming a decent amount. But we still only want to play limps and no raises for pretty much any size. Something that we see very often is people go for like 5x raises and stuff like that when there is an auto-link stack. And simply that is not enough. The reason being that you don't really price out anyone with a half decent hand. People will still be getting the odds to call. So because of that, we want to go for a very limp-heavy strategy and just embrace the fact that we'll go multi-way and just hope to win the bounty. For that, I have run a few different example spots. We will be taking our usual tournament scenario where this is a 530 buy-in with a 25k starting stack. Big blind now is 500, and everyone has the starting bounty. So a standing bounty would be worth around, as we said, 1/4 of the starting stack here. So around 6.5k or 13 big blinds. For this scenario, we'll be looking at what happens from the last 6 positions. So from the low jack onwards. And for the first example, what I did was I assigned the big blind a 0 chip stack. So basically just auto-all-in. And also I switched the bottom stack with low jacks. The reason I did that was to see how a single auto-all-in stack would influence the strategies and not allow for another short stack to affect that. So everyone has the stack sizes we see, except big blind is all-in, bottom has 47, and low jack has 21. Right, so the bounty here, as we said, is worth about 13.5 big blinds. So the under the gun player, or the low jack, in this case, who has 21 big blinds, actually wants to be jamming a lot. The reason we get to have all these jams is that we're playing 21 big blinds and there is 13 dead big blinds in the pot. Because of that, we just really want to jam and try to fold out as many people as we can in order to claim the free 13 big blinds lying in the middle. Think about it as if let's say the ante for some reason was 13 big blinds and you were playing 21, you would want to get it in very, very wide, right? And this is sort of a similar situation. Against this super wide jamming range, players behind will also end up calling very, very wide. For example, the hijack, who is still covered by all three players behind, is getting it in with 31%. After the hijack jams, the cutoff is calling like half his range. So basically, we can see that these are spots where the ranges are going to be super, super, super wide, and there's just a lot of gambling going on. Now, if under the gun folds, then we go to the hijack as 44 big blinds. And because the hijack stack is a bit too large, we don't really see almost any jams. For sizes, we have allowed a 2.2x, 3.5x, and 5 big blind raise size, and we can see those are used like 0% of the time. So we want to be limping a very, very wide range, and we also get to have a few jams. Now, these jams are there because the bounty is worth so much. If the bounty was worth, let's say, 8 big blinds or 5 big blinds, then we wouldn't have these jams, and we would instead just go into a limp range kind of strategy. Similar to what we saw before, after the hijack limps, the cutoff mostly wants to overlimp. So limps 90%, or VPIP is 90% of his range, 73% of which are limps. We again see no all-in raises, even 6 big blinds just not used, and a bunch of jams. Again, jamming 50 big blinds, which is the effective stack size behind, is a lot. But we need to remember that there is 13 dead big blinds in. And if someone calls, it's going to be 13 more dead blinds. So the actual effective stack size, if you consider the bounties, is much lower, which is why we see all these offsuit ace-X jamming, low pocket pairs, low suited aces. After the cutoff calls, again, the players behind want to be doing a lot of overcalling. You can see the button calling a lot, and again, jamming fairly wide because now both ranges are very weak. And this is the same thing that will be happening everywhere. When there is the auto-limp stack, we are very, very incentivized to limp, and the more players that limp, the wider we can jam afterwards. So, for example, if hijack limps and then cutoff limps and then button over limps, then the small blind is jamming very, very wide for value. You can see it's 50 big blinds and covered by the cutoff, but still jamming any ace, any Broadway, any pocket pair, suited 9x, suited kings, suited aces. The reason being that, again, all these ranges are going to be extremely wide, and there is the 13 dead big blinds in the middle. And also, if hijack or button call, we have 13 more dead blinds in the middle. If the small blind jams, then hijack is calling pretty much any half decent hand he has. Cutoff, the same, and the button just doesn't have too much of a calling range. Because the button was the position that was jamming the widest, so there are just no strong hands left in the button's range. Cutoff is calling the widest because he also covers the small blind, whereas the other positions do not. Right. So the more people fold towards the button, I mean, it shouldn't really be happening, but let's say under the gun has 7 deuce off and hijack has 7 deuce off, and the cutoff has 7 deuce off, because there are so many 7 deuce off in this deck, then the button, who is pretty much the last player to act because the small blind is just auto-ling with the big blind, again folds 0 and just jams some offsuit ace-X. Against the button's limp, small blind plays like this. So when the small blind chooses to isolate, we only see this very large 8.5x big blind sizing and a bunch of jams as well. So this should hopefully show very clearly that once we have the big blind auto lean, the main action we want to be doing is limping. And once people limp more and more and more, then we start jamming wider for value, but still want to be limping a lot. For the next example, what we're going to do is instead of having the big blind being auto lean, we are going to have the button being auto lean. So what I did is I just switched the big blinds and the button stack. So we again have the low jack player with 21 big blinds. The button has 46, and then the button has 0, and the big blind has 46 as he does now. You can see here the stacks as well. So instead of the big blind being auto lean closing the action, now the big blind actually gets to play. Under the gun strategy looks very, very similar. Slightly more jamming, but yeah, basically the same strategy. Hijack, the same. Cutoff, the same. So even though that the button is all in now, we see very, very similar kind of strategies, a lot of limping and very few jams with like offsuit ace-x and low pocket pairs primarily. Worth checking here is how does the big blind play against a lot of limps? So let's say hijack limps and then cutoff over limps. And then the small blind calls as well. Again, we can see that the small blind doesn't use any non-all-in sizings. I allowed many different sizings, and pretty much all-in is the only one used. So after the small blind overcalls, then this is how the big blind plays. We can again see that because now he's up against already 3 very wide limps, even though the big blind is covered by 2 out of the 3 limping players, he gets to jam a really, really wide range. King 7 off, just a value jam, like any Broadway, suited kings, the aces, pocket pairs, just really, really wide jamming range. And the reasoning is that after the big blind jumps, hijack has to fold a lot, and then cutoff has to fold a bunch of hands, small blind too. So basically, because the limping ranges are so ridiculously wide, we get to jam a very wide value range as well. Now, we need to be aware of our opponent's tendencies for these kind of spots. Because, for example, some people might be raising some of their strong hands and then their limps will only be super weak hands. In that case, we can be jamming a lot wider than this for value, like any king, for example. However, we will also have the opposite kind of players where they will instead not be limping as wide as they should. For example, from the hijack, they will not be limping queen 3 off or jack 6 off. And if the hijack limps, then from the cutoff, they will not be limping 10 deuce off or 10 4 off, 7 4 off, and so on. So the tighter they are, the tighter we can value jam as the covered closing action stack. So we always need to be aware of how people perceive these spots and how they play. Obviously, we will never have perfect information, but by paying a lot of attention to our table and their actions, we will be able to have some basic idea. And the final spot that I have is we're now under the gun, or low jack is the auto all-in player. So low jack is all-in, and then the stack size behind are, as you can see them here. So low jack is all-in, and then we have 44, 57, 21, 50, and 47. What do we have here? So again, the strategy will look very, very similar. Extremely limp heavy, and the closer we go towards the action ending, the more jams we get to see. For example, the button with 20 big blinds with the shorter stack just doesn't get to have any calls, just jumps a super wide range. Small blind, who is, if it falls to the small blind, who is basically the last player to act before the big blind, gets to jam super, super wide and doesn't fold anything. We again have the overcalling train. Once hijack calls, then cutoff ends up overcalling a lot. Then the button, even with 20 big blinds, ends up overcalling a lot. And if the button calls, then the small blind calls everything. So same thing we've been seeing. And if the small blind calls, the big blind just jumps a super wide kind of value range. So we can see that regardless of which position the all-in stack is, the strategies look the same. A lot of limping, basically only limping, and then jamming some kind of ace-x pocket pair heavy range. The smaller the bounty, as I said, the more limps and less jams we see. But we pretty much never get to a spot where we get to have raises against the auto-all-in or super short stack. Maybe if, let's say, the bounty was worth like half a big blind or something, then we would play much closer to a normal strategy. But as long as the bounty is even remotely valuable, then this is how we play. We limp and overlimp and overlimp and overlimp. Now, as said, people don't really play like that. They end up playing a much more raise-heavy range. So for that, we just always need to keep pot odds into account. Like, let's say, for example, in this spot, we have under the gun all-in, and then cutoff goes for a 7x raise. So then we need to add the 13 blinds to the pot and then see the odds we're getting from the big blind, for example, to defend. And still, we need to jam a very wide value range. So understanding like the main theory behind bounties and how much a bounty is worth and how it affects our odds help us play well against people who don't play well, if that makes sense. So we know for ourselves that we're supposed to limp a lot. People don't. So when they make the mistake, we need to be able to adjust on the spot. Okay, with that, we can wrap this chapter up. This was a fairly short chapter because we're just not much to say. This spot is very similar to the one we saw in limping. And yeah, basically, one takeaway, limp a lot and jump when the boundary is very, very relevant.